about how I got here. I'm an occupational therapist by training, and I work back home for a hospice organization. And it's been a privilege. I mean, it's a passion of mine to be a hospice worker. A lot of hospice workers will say that. But I realized sort of firsthand, when my family received the hospice benefit a time or two, I figured out that hospice was not just for a patient. Hospice was for the whole family. And then along through my training, I also learned that people with dementia have missed their hospice benefit more often than people who die with other diseases. So for instance, people with cancer typically receive the full hospice benefit, while people with dementia may miss it. It's never been because good hospice workers don't care about these folks. It's just that understanding the end stage of this disease, I've always said, is tricky and feels more like reading tea leaves than, you know, black and white. So in our hospice, we kind of set out on a mission to make a dementia care program and deliver the hospice benefit more to people in our community with dementia. But I'm lucky because in our hospice, we also do home health. It's like having two businesses under one roof. And what it means for me is that I don't have to wait until the end to meet the people. I'm meeting families and patients earlier in the disease through home health. And it's given me a continuum of care in my practice, almost like working in a continuing care retirement community or a state veterans home that has assisted living and dementia care. So that's sort of how I come to the population in my clinical practice. I'm the director of disease management at our hospice, and the traveling and teaching and consulting I do in my own business called Partnerships for Health. For about 6 years now, I've been working with state veterans homes. They're like my favorite partners, because although this is a very state-of-the-art facility, veterans homes set the bar high. And in state veterans homes especially, the leaders in dementia care. So I've learned as much from veterans homes as I've ever left behind. The state veterans homes a few years ago started a national project of making dementia care videos, a series called Dementia Care for America's Heroes. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that tonight, just as sort of an introduction to that project. But from the bottom of my heart, I'm just glad you're here, because I think that this is one of the best places to have a loved one. And, you know, my grandparents also had dementia. I'm always a family caregiver in addition to a professional. I mean, sometimes I just take my therapy hat off and want to talk to you like a granddaughter, because my grandmother had vascular dementia for the better part of 15 years. And I always say she was healthy as a horse. I mean, there was nothing else the matter with her. She went through every stage of that disease and passed away from dementia, not from something else. So one of the things I thought we might talk a little bit about tonight was how the brain changes and how you might recognize some stages or changes in the person that you know best. It's always started for me with some pictures. Now, maybe because it's easier for me to explain things when I have a picture in front of me. And these pictures are famous. They come from the University of Alabama. I always put them in your handout, because if you're explaining things to a person in your family or someone at church and a neighbor, sometimes it's helpful to have the pictures. When you put this in front of somebody, one of the first questions they'll ask is, what's the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia? And I've always used this as sort of a launching pad for the quick, handy explanation. This is in your pocket. Dementia is the umbrella term because it's the category of diseases. And underneath the umbrella, there are all different types. This fella was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. That was his type. My grandmother had vascular dementia. You may know somebody with Lewy body dementia, frontal temporal lobe dementia, or early onset. They're all different, but they're all dementia. What worked in my family, and I give you this for your pocket explanation because you will see heads nod, is when you connect the vocabulary to the cancer words, because people know that cancer is an umbrella term. So I always say dementia is a word like cancer. And there's skin cancer, lung cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer. It goes down the line. And people in America know that skin cancer is different from lung cancer, but they're both cancer. That clicks. So while this fella had Alzheimer's disease, and you're looking at a brain about 10 years after diagnosis, one of the common changes that happen with every type of dementia, even if this had been my grandmother's brain with vascular dementia, is the color difference. You see how this one is so much darker? Well, the darker brain is because there are 1 billion cells that are sick before they're dead. I mean, I always say that's not the rocket science, but a cell is sick before it's dead. And a sick cell is darker. It's just a little shriveled up. It's not what it used to be. And 1 billion sick cells cast a shadow on that brain, and it's darker than a healthy brain. By the time I sort of get into a quick explanation of that, if you're showing these pictures to somebody, watch, they'll say, well, which one am I? If they think they're looking at an old brain next to a young brain. But that's not the case. This brain, they're both the same age, 82 years old. That's an 82-year-old brain with no dementia. Looks as good as mine. This color change is because the disease is happening and the cells are shrinking as they're sick, and it shrinks in the whole brain because a sick cell dies and falls off. But this darker color accounts for all the fluctuation you'll see. And what you will notice, and the research tells me that family members will notice this before anyone else, is that your loved one is not the same all the time. They have good days and bad days. They have good times of day and bad times of day. One fella came into my family consultation program, sits down and says, I'm taking care of my wife, but she reminds me of a radio station. And I said, what are you talking about, the radio station? And he said, it's like sometimes she's there, like the signal is coming through, and then sometimes it's like I drive out of the signal and I just can't get through to her. I drive right back into it and she's back. I showed him the picture of the darker brain because he picked up on the in and out fluctuation, had just never seen the explanation of the science behind those changes. Some folks will see sundowning. Have you heard of this term? It's when a person with dementia looks different in the evening. They might be more confused, have more trouble. It's when they get tired. And the term sundowning just refers to the fact that it happens lots of times in the evening. You've got a different person at nighttime than you did at lunchtime. But once I show folks the color difference, I'm quick to explain that it has nothing to do with the sun. It's when these darker cells get tired. It's like they just don't stay up like they used to. He's got 1 billion fewer cells when they're tired than he did when they were all firing at lunchtime. So sundowning, if you go one step further then with common sense, sundowning is going to happen anytime he's tired. If he didn't have a good night's sleep last night, if he ran wide open yesterday, or he's not feeling well and tossed and turned, if he's not having a good day, you can see that sundowning in the morning, middle of the day, because it's darker cells closing shop. Inside this brain, there are a few pictures I wanted to show you, and then give you a quick rundown of some levels before I really am most interested in some questions that you might have. But let me handle this first because it might answer a few. This is the memory center. It's going to get hit on every type of dementia. It's not just Alzheimer's disease. There are some memory files that everybody's heard of, short-term, long-term memory. But there are some memory files that not everyone has heard of. And for one is a memory file that goes through that hole called immediate recall. Immediate recall is what just happened. Boom, that quick. The first time you'll pick up on this, someone having trouble with immediate recall, is when you might hear the same question back to back, then to back, to back, to back, to back, same question. It's literally, it's not that they don't hear you, because if you raise your voice, he'll say, don't shout at me. but it's that he's not taking the information and filing it on immediate recall, what just happened. The questions are pretty easy to pick up on, but you might miss something more subtle, like, for instance, someone's having trouble with immediate recall. I can sit down and have a meal with them. They will enjoy the entire meal, eat everything, and as soon as we walk away from the table, he'll say, "What are we going to have to eat? I haven't had anything in forever. Why did I not get one? Everybody else got something and I haven't had anything for days." He literally just finished the meal. It's really not that he's trying to game us for another plate. It's out of sight, out of mind. I was at a state veterans home out in Oklahoma, and they had run into this problem because they're familiar with it. It happens a lot in dementia care. When a person comes in early for the early morning breakfast sitting, and in this case it's an old farmer, he's been getting up at the crack of dawn, his entire life. He's always the first one in the dining room, 6 o'clock in the morning. And so he sits down. His usual style is, "Come on in, have a seat." He says, "Give me the usual." Well, for Charlie, the usual is this huge country breakfast, and he eats all of it. So it comes out on a red carpet, and he cleans his plate and is walking out of the dining room when he runs into a fella who's coming in for the 8 o'clock sitting. And Charlie said, "What are you doing?" And this guy said, "I'm going to get something to eat." Charlie said, "Good, I'll go with you." Okay. So he's on his little walker there and sits down at the table and says, "Give me the usual." And they said, "Charlie, where are you going to put it? I mean, you have had enough to feed an army." And he's going back and forth. "I want the same thing I've eaten my whole life. Don't tell me to change now." So in the kitchen, they said, "Stop arguing with Charlie. Take it out there to him. If we throw it away, nobody's in trouble." So here comes the country breakfast. All the sides and the fixins. The only problem is Charlie ate it. He stuffed himself to like a tick. Now, people with dementia will miss their signals. They'll go outside, it's cold, they can't figure out why their toes are cold. They'll go, they'll sit out in the sun, they, sweating and dehydrated. Why do I not feel well? They're missing their signals. They'll walk around on an empty stomach with their blood sugars dropped and they don't feel well, but they can't figure out why. So anyway, Charlie has sat there and missed his signals. So he's belly aching out to the bathroom and can't figure out why he doesn't feel well. By the time he comes out, here comes the 10 o'clock breakfast sitting, and he's back. Well, skip through that. I get to the interdisciplinary team meeting in the morning after breakfast, and they said, "Charlie's sick." And the doctor said, "Well, what's wrong with Charlie? I just saw him." And they said, "Well, he's had 3 of those breakfasts of his." And everybody's jaw hits the table, and they said, "What?" Well, it was so brilliant because it was a CNA who was working in the dining room that morning who said, "Don't worry about it. We got to get one step ahead of him." And the kitchen manager said, "It's an immediate recall issue." And I was just blown away because not everywhere that I visit, not every team that I work with all understands basic dementia care changes. And here I've got a kitchen manager, a CNA, and a medical director who all know the deal. And the CNA said, "We're one step ahead of him," and the kitchen manager said, "Pancakes are shrinking." And they actually knew the strategy was to just work the portions instead of arguing with him about what to eat and when to eat it. The most brilliant thing I thought that the CNA said, she chimed in and said, "It's not just what you say, but how you say it," to Charlie. She said, "He says, 'Give me the usual,' and folks, all he wants to hear is, 'Sir, yes, sir.'" So we can deal with the details in the kitchen. As long as we're communicating with Charlie the way he's always preferred and we're working those portions, he can hang around for seconds. He might be there all morning and can have thirds. But we can help him drive around that problem of immediate recall. Now, these are some things that happen with people who have dementia that are just about predictable. When immediate recall goes, they can miss a meal that they just ate. Another kind of memory that goes through this whole, though, that shows up on the timeline in our levels that I wanted to talk about tonight is a memory file called situational memory. And this is one that not everybody's heard about, because situational memory works like this. You hold information in order. The order of things helps you understand your situation. This is how you got here. Okay, so everybody knows why they're sitting in that seat, because it started with A, and A led to B, led to C, led to D, and that's how you got here. When they miss situational memory, they have trouble putting things together in order. And you've started to notice this, because he might say something like, what are we doing here? How did I get here? What is the name of this place? What am I supposed to be doing now? Who put all this together? Is that for me? And you're thinking to yourself, bless his heart, as many times as I explain this situation, it doesn't seem to add up. Like he can't put it all together. That's situational memory. If I had to just pause and imagine, if I had to imagine missing my situational memory and not knowing how I got here, I just know for a fact I would be out of my skin. It's understandable to me why people get so ill at ease and out of sorts and on eggshells, you know, kind of really anxious when they don't know how they got here. Then it always kind of tickles me when somebody's sort of blasé about it too. I was walking through the emergency department not too long ago in my little home hospital, where I was doing some training with the emergency department nurses, and our class was over and I was going to the car. But walking through the emergency department waiting room, I see this fella sitting over on the wall, and he looks like he's just waiting to be seen. And he's got his daughter there next to him. And he's clearly the patient, because I can see from where I'm standing, he has this huge purple pump knot on his head like a goose egg. And he turned over to his daughter and said, what are we doing here? She said, Daddy, we got to get you checked out. And he said, checked out for what? She said, because you fell. And he said, no. She said, yes, you've been falling for 2 weeks. And she said, put your hand up there to your head. And he does. He just sticks his hand up there and feels that pump knot. And he said, what is that? And she said, it's a knot on your head. He said, how did it get there? She goes, you fell. No. So they're just going around the mulberry bush. He can't line it all up, and she packed her patience because she was going to explain that situation till the cows came home. And what I noticed was she was doing so good keeping that tone of voice like it was mind over matter. She sounded so great. And she's probably learned from experience that if she loses her tone, he catches her on it. And here's why. A lot of family members haven't heard the science behind that, even though you figured it out. There's a memory file right here on this brain that sticks. And the memories that work the best are emotional memories. They're spared by the disease. When other things go through the hole, it's the emotional memory that sticks. And here's the trick. Emotional memory picks up on tone and the vibe and the air or the feeling. I have always thought of this in my own little brain like a radar, because it feels to me like the emotional center of my hippocampus is scanning. And I pick up not just on the information that I'm given, but I pick up on a feeling. I can tell when somebody's in a bad mood. I mean, I just have to be near them for a few minutes, because my radar picks up on not just what they do, but kind of how they're doing it, and I can tell they're not really feeling right. And sometimes we'll say things like, we're here walking on eggshells, or you could cut the air in there with a knife, or you might say, there's an elephant in the room. We might as well just get it on the table. Or you'll say, it's not what she said, it's what she didn't say. There was more to it than that. That is your emotional memory file at work. That's your radar scanning. They'll pick up on things like a lie. A lie doesn't sound the same as a truth. I might have trouble with the facts and how it all lines up, but I can tell when you're shooting me the bull. They'll pick up on things like you're in a rush. You're in a hurry, and it's not really what you're doing, it's just how you're doing it that feels just a little bit, you know, upbeat little pace.
Is it kind of like because their regular memory is missing, their emotional memory
like stronger?
Is on
high alert.
Kind of like people who are blind can hear way better.
Yeah.
And it's that same kind of thing because it's missing their intuition. That section is hyper sensitive.
I've always said, and this probably makes sense to you when I say it, it's not a very scientific thing to say, but they're in their feelings. They're in their feelings means they might not have all the information, so they're scanning with everything they've got to figure out what's going on around here. And what they've got is their radar. It's the most important thing that I've ever learned about dementia, is that I have a radar and so do they, because it literally changed my practice. It changed my communication with my grandmother. It changed the communication in my work. I shifted from a focus on the facts to a steady focus on the feelings. And I knew that then it wasn't as important what I said as how I said it. And I might have to repeat something 1,000 times, but the first time I slip my tone, I'm busted. And it doesn't mean that I don't make mistakes. It doesn't mean that I'm perfect and get it right every time. But every time I get busted, I know how. I know how it happened. One of the things that a lot of folks might not have heard, you might be the first to tell them in your family or your community, is that dementia is not just about memory. This is the language center. And this is a language disorder. This communication breakdown. Because this is the part of the brain where you're understanding language. And over here, you just see that it's so different. But there's something interesting about language in that it's stored separately in files like memories. This area here looks like it's hit hard, while there's some good places out here on the edge. Now, if you pay attention, you'll see that people with dementia understand chit-chat, the social back and forth, what we call in North Carolina swapping howdies. And swapping howdies goes back and forth like, how you doing? It's good to see you. You're looking good. You're staying busy. You know, everything going all right with your people? How are things back at your place? That has nothing in the world to do with the facts. And in fact, most people have automatic questions with automatic answers. So you could be having a lousy day and somebody says, how you doing? You say, fine. So this is a rhythm. And often, out here on the edge, it's rhythmic languages that they catch. The rhythm of the chit-chat is a tick-tock. What they're missing is a file called formal language. Formal language is the information, the instructions, or the explanation. It's the meat of what you're trying to tell them. They don't understand. And one thing that you might have picked up on is when you switch back and forth from social chit-chat to information, you can have him on the line, you're communicating, like the signal is clear when you're swapping howdies. As soon as you give him an instruction or a question, what? What was that? He didn't understand that part, but it's kind of like you changed languages. And to just sort of round it out, you produce language in another spot. So they understand language in one area and they spit it out somewhere completely different. And those are major holes. I mean, just spitting it out is hard for many of your parents. You know, your brother might have trouble making the words. And at first it sounds like it's on the tip of his tongue. But then later on it sounds like he just doesn't have the information. The greeting could sound good. So Tim was walking through the Trinity unit this morning, and we were visiting with the fella who was sitting there. I mean, he was in such a good sort of social visit with a helper who was sitting right beside him. He's got a sweatshirt on that says Grandpa. He's got his cap on, and he looks good. And Tim walks through there, and he says, hey, hey, hey. And Tim's like, hey, how you doing? And the guy said, good. And then the one thing that said, and hey, I don't even the way all of the. And so as soon as the greeting sounded great, he couldn't get his words out to say what was on his mind. I mean, it's so great to see from the administrator all the way through the maintenance staff roll with that. And the communication that sounds like, you're looking good today, buddy. And he said, thank you. And he said, well, what are you going to be up to later? And he said, the thing, and Tim said, I'll be glad to see you this afternoon. And he said, I'm looking forward to it. So right there, from the top of the organization, using chit-chat in the social rhythm to connect with somebody who's missing a lot of their language, I'm like, you know, it's obviously sort of in the culture of the organization. Now, there is something that I should mention, because you might tell it to somebody, or maybe it's the first you've heard. There's a file right here in that bright spot labeled expletives. And people with dementia will cuss a blue streak, even if they've never cussed before in their life. I've taken care of nuns and priests and these little grandmas who have raised a, you know, complete family of grandchildren, and people said, my mother never, not where anybody could hear it, we've never heard a swear word. And it's not that she didn't have the language. It's that she had a giant frontal lobe to hold it all in her whole life, because we all have these separate language files. This just happens to be a perfect storm, that they're losing a lot of the other languages, and that expletives file is there without the reins on the horse to pull back and say, whoa, not here, not now. So if it's running across their mind, it's usually running out their mouth before they have that filter to kind of say, whoa, this is something that in the biz, Sonia's grinning, because we have heard it all. I mean, and one thing I figured out along the years is that cussing, few things here, cussing is different, feels different at least, when it's personal. Because your husband could be carrying on and kicking up dust and, you know, cussing a blue streak, and because he's not my husband, I can roll with it. I'm just going to stay quiet, because I know if I say anything, it's going to make it matter. But if it's my husband kicking up dust around here, calling people every name in the book, I am at the end of my rope. It's just because it's personal. If your mother said something that was inappropriate or maybe even hurtful, I could probably roll with that a lot better than I could if it was my mom. And it came from my whole personal life. So I've always said to professional caregivers who will tell me right off the bat, they'll say, these family members should just be able to roll with this stuff a little bit better. And I said, has this ever happened to you? Have you ever been in the other side of this? I realized something when my grandmother was in a dementia care unit back home in the mountains of western North Carolina. My accent comes from the Appalachian Mountains, and you cannot rinse it out. My grandmother was a mountain woman. She was in the dementia care unit, and I'm telling y'all, it was the hardest thing for me to go and visit her. And I'm just saying that because it's kind of remarkable that I was a dementia care specialist at the time. I was already traveling around teaching, and I love to visit people in dementia care units. I kind of just enjoy it. So when I came into my grandmother's unit and felt terrible, it was always distressing to me, but I realized I'm just dragging my whole life through the door with me. And one of the things I did, taking my own advice, was I would always come with something to do, something to look at, something to talk about, because when they're missing a lot of the language files, I'm better off with visual cues, something that we could kind of see together. And so I had always told family members, don't come empty-handed. So I'm trying to take my own advice. And I would stop at the grocery store because it was right at the bottom of the mountain, and I would usually pick up something that was pretty, you know, basic, simple, cheap, And I would go up there with something in my hand to do. It could be a bag of black beans and a bag of white beans. I would put them in a bowl together, and I would sit down with her and say, we got to get these apart.